This is Chalino Sánchez, a Mexican singer who captivated the country with his bold songs and striking personality. One night, during what seemed to be just another show, he received a mysterious note that would change everything. Hours later, his body was found on a deserted road, showing signs of torture and gunshot wounds to the head. Stay with me to uncover the surprising details of this story. Chalino Sánchez was actually the stage name of Rosalino Sánchez Felix. He was born on August 30th, 1960, on a small farm called Las Flechas in the municipality of El Guayabo, located in the state of Sinaloa. He was the youngest of 8 siblings. His family was quite humble, and they had to survive on less than the basics. He grew up in a place with few opportunities and surrounded by violence. When he was just 6 years old, his father passed away. As a result, Chalino's older brother, Lucas Sánchez, took care of the younger siblings along with their mother. Chalino didn't like his real name. He thought Rosalino sounded too feminine and preferred to introduce himself as Marcelino Sánchez, which later became Chalino. Having grown up in a violent environment, Chalino came to believe from a very young age that violence could solve everything. He was not the type of person to bow down to others. In 1975, one of Chalino's sisters, named Joanna, went to a party where some of the attendees were involved in crime. One of them was a known drug dealer in the area named El Chapo Perez. El Chapo Perez, along with some friends, forced Chalino's sister to have relations with them. Joanna came home dirty and completely devastated and humiliated. Chalino was very young at the time, only 15 years old, but nonetheless he swore revenge on El Chapo Perez and his friends. Months passed and Chalino never forgot the scene of his sister coming home crying in despair. El Chapo Perez and his men may have forgotten the harm they did to Joanna, but Chalino did not. Guys, just a quick note here. The El Chapo I'm referring to in this story, who allegedly assaulted Chalino's sister, is not the same El Chapo, Joaquin Guzman Loera, the infamous leader of the Sinaloa cartel who was sentenced to life in prison and widely reported on around the world, okay? And unfortunately, there are no photos of him available on the internet. Back to the case. On November 20th, 1975, a celebration for the anniversary of the Mexican Revolution was taking place in the city. Chalino learned that El Chapo Perez would be at the party and decided to go there seeking revenge. El Chapo Perez was sitting next to 2 of his brothers when Chalino approached and shot him right in the head. In that moment, the crowded venue turned into chaos, with people running and screaming in all directions. El Chapo Perez's brothers, who were also armed, drew their weapons and began firing at Chalino, who returned fire. According to news reports at the time, neither Chalino nor El Chapo Perez's brothers were hit. However, El Chapo Perez died at the scene before help arrived. Thus, Chalino Sánchez got his revenge. Chalino fled the party through a dense wooded area, covering several kilometers until he reached home. There, he packed some clothes and supplies before heading to the hills, where he hid for 2 weeks. Chalino knew he had crossed paths with very dangerous people, and that if he stayed in Mexico, he would be hunted. Aware of this, Chalino decided to illegally cross into the United States. He managed to get across the border without being caught and later moved to Oregon. He worked there for a while before deciding to relocate to California, specifically Los Angeles, where an aunt of his lived. To survive, Chalino took on odd jobs as they came up. Some sources say that he also engaged in drug dealing to make money. However, this is denied by some people who knew Chalino. Later, Chalino began working as a coyote alongside his brother, Armando Sánchez. The two helped illegal Mexican immigrants cross the border between Mexico and the United States safely. They made good money from this. However, some immigrants would flee without paying after crossing the border. Chalino and Armando continued this activity for a few years until, in 1984, Armando, who was staying at a hotel in Tijuana, was shot multiple times and died. This was yet another tragic event in Chalino's life. Shortly after, Chalino was arrested, accused of committing various petty crimes. He was sentenced to 8 months in prison. While in prison, Chalino reconnected with his cousin, a man named Ismael Sánchez, who knew how to play the guitar. This detail is important. In addition to Ismael, Chalino also re-encountered several acquaintances who had lived in the same region as him in Mexico. Many of these acquaintances knew how to play an instrument, and this was crucial for Chalino to get closer to music and become the well-known singer he eventually became. His time in prison with his cousin Ismael and the other inmates who could play instruments sparked Chalino's great interest in songs. He began to compose and sing while his cousin and other inmates provided the melody. The inmates who saw Chalino sing said he had a natural talent and that sooner or later he would become quite famous. Chalino merely smiled shyly, and even though he didn't fully believe it, he liked the idea. In prison, Chalino began to compose and sing songs that depicted the lives of some inmates, often at their request. Initially, Chalino did this for free, but as the requests grew, he started charging money and asking for favors in return. After serving his 8-month sentence and being released from prison, Chalino returned to Los Angeles, where he washed cars to make a living. Later, he began working as a driver for Rigoberto Campos Salcido, also known as El Rigo, who owned a restaurant and was involved in drug trafficking. Rigoberto was a wealthy man due to his criminal involvement. However, he was having problems with the Arellano Felix brothers cartel. This was because the area where Rigoberto operated as a trafficker was considered their territory by the brothers. The Arellano Felix brothers contacted Rigoberto and told him that if he wanted to continue selling in that area, he would have to pay them a percentage of his profits. Everyone operating in areas deemed the brothers' territory had to pay them a cut. The brothers were feared. They had taken the lives of many who crossed their path, and few dared to challenge them. Rigoberto was one of those few. He was not afraid of the brothers and decided to ignore their warning. Rigoberto continued trafficking in the following months until one day, 6 heavily armed men stormed his house and kidnapped him. Rigoberto was taken to a hideout, where he was beaten for hours and then had his arms mutilated. The men left Rigoberto alive. They only wanted to send him a message from the Arellano Felix brothers. Rigoberto had to amputate both arms, yet he continued to operate as a trafficker in the same location, refusing to pay anything to the brothers. A few months later, the Arellano Felix brothers learned that Rigoberto would be attending a horse race in Tijuana, Mexico, to place bets. The brothers then decided to set a trap for him. They knew the route Rigoberto would take to return to the city and prepared an ambush. So as Rigoberto was heading back to the city, he was ambushed by over 20 heavily armed men. According to reports, the men fired more than 600 shots at Rigoberto's car. Both he and his bodyguard, who was also his driver, died at the scene. At that time, Chalino was no longer working for Rigoberto, but learned what had happened to his former boss. Years later, Chalino would write a song in honor of his late boss called Rigoberto Campos, which became somewhat popular in Mexico. After stopping work with Rigoberto, Chalino met a woman named Marisela Valero. The two began dating and later got married. Together they had 2 children, Adan Sanchez and Cynthia Sanchez Vallejo. In the same year he got married, Chalino wrote a song in memory of his deceased brother, Armando Sanchez. Soon, word spread that Chalino was writing commissioned songs, and many people contacted him to place song requests. Chalino's musical style is known as narco corrido. The narco corrido is a subgenre of the regional Mexican corrido genre, from which several other musical styles have evolved. Chalino's songs narrated the deeds, struggles, and stories of bandits and drug traffickers in a world filled with violence. The Mexican corrido is an extremely popular musical genre in Mexico and also in the southern United States. It is part of the struggle stories of the Mexican people, as it blends narrative and poetry, detailing the everyday oppression of the culture and chronicling the exploits of important historical figures in the form of a song. In the past, corridos were used to inform the illiterate. This occurred long before the advent of telephones and televisions. The heroes depicted in the lyrics were often popular figures during the Mexican revolutions, such as Pancho Villa, who was a general in the Mexican Revolution and also the governor of Chihuahua. These songs celebrated nationalism in the country, and despite their significance in the culture of the Mexican people, the style was gradually being forgotten. However, Chalino Sánchez brought it back into popular taste. He not only revived it, but also transformed this musical style. At this point in his story, Chalino began receiving numerous song requests. Various people contacted him, from small delinquents to the most dangerous criminals in Southern California and Baja California, Mexico. Chalino accepted anything of value for his compositions. He received jewelry, clothing, and even weapons as payment for his songs. After managing to gather a good amount of money, Chalino decided to hire a band to record his music. However, when it came time to record, the band he hired lacked knowledge of the narco corrido style, and in the end, Chalino had to record everything by himself. It is said that Chalino took 4 hours to record 15 songs, including one he had written in tribute to his late brother Armando. As I mentioned earlier, Chalino only had a closer contact with music after he was imprisoned. Before that, despite his love for music, he had never studied it and barely knew how to play any instrument. We can say that his time in prison was a turning point in his life that, in a way, helped him become a successful singer in Mexico. However, Chalino himself did not consider himself a high-level singer. He just enjoyed composing and singing his songs. He began recording the songs requested by his clients, and although the quality wasn't great, people liked them because the music spoke to their experiences or related to something that had happened to them. Chalino's popularity grew, especially since the people who commissioned songs from him spread the word to others who didn't know him yet. The famous word-of-mouth promotion. Additionally, many of Chalino's clients started requesting copies of the tapes he recorded for them, so they could gift them to friends and family. Angel Parra, the owner of the studio where Chalino recorded, suggested they go to a cassette tape factory since the demand was increasing weekly. They then ordered a large quantity of tapes, 300 in total, recorded on both sides A and B. And for those who weren't around at that time, that's hard to believe. This was around 1986 and 1987. By 1989, Chalino had his own band that recorded with him. In the early 1990s, Chalino met a man named Pedro Rivera. Pedro Rivera was the owner of Cintas Aquario, a record label and music studio located in Long Beach, California. Pedro Rivera recognized that Chalino was becoming increasingly popular among Mexican immigrants in the United States and also among Mexicans in Mexico. He saw a great opportunity and made a proposal to Chalino, who accepted. Pedro Rivera's record label was small but was one of the first independent labels focused on the Mexican audience. Consequently, they had a considerable audience that consumed the music distributed by the label. Moreover, their distribution strategy was different from that of major record labels. They typically paid people to sell tapes in areas with a high concentration of Mexican immigrants in the United States. They also left numerous tapes in local businesses, such as small markets, bakeries, and even car washes. The owners of these businesses kept a percentage of each tape sold, which encouraged them to promote the recordings to potential customers. The songs that were most popular among Mexicans at the time were more geared towards entertainment. In contrast, Chalino's songs expressed the reality of the Mexican people across all social layers. This was a differentiating factor that helped him gain even more fans. After signing a contract with Pedro Rivera's label, Chalino's tapes began to be distributed in areas where no one had previously known who he was. The tape sales were promising, and at this point, Chalino realized he could indeed be a successful singer. With that in mind, he decided to quit his job to focus solely on his singing career. Most of his time was spent writing, recording his own songs, and then driving around with a car full of tapes to sell them. With each passing day, he became increasingly popular among Latino immigrants in California. Shortly after, he was invited to perform at El Pajal, a nightclub of the time. It's said that when people learned Chalino would be performing there, they crowded into the venue to see him. Chalino never left home without his gun and his chain with a medal of Jesus Malverde. For those who don't know, Jesus Malverde is the saint of narcos. His cult emerged in the mid-1970s, and one of the most common traditions is to tattoo the face of this saint as a form of protection. In January 1992, Chalino performed at a club called Coachella. By this point, he was quite famous in the Latino community in Southern California and among Mexicans. The Coachella Club was packed, with most attendees there to see Chalino sing. After performing a few songs, Chalino went into the audience and began taking song requests from his fans. In the crowd, there was a man who didn't like Chalino for no apparent reason. His name was Edward Alvarado Gallegos. He was 33 years old and worked as a mechanic. According to sources, Edward was drunk and under the influence of drugs. He harassed some people in the audience who ignored him, but he wouldn't stop there. He was about to do something even worse. At one point, while Chalino was singing, Edward jumped onto the stage, drew his gun, and fired several shots at Chalino. Despite being distracted, Chalino reacted quickly. He jumped back, pulled out his pistol, and fired at Edward. Both Chalino and Edward were shot. Several audience members were also hit, including a man celebrating his anniversary with his girlfriend, who died from his injuries. Edward was arrested and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Despite various speculations that the attack was ordered by a rival of Chalino, Edward never revealed anything about it. After the shooting at Coachella, Chalino became even more famous, and many people began seeking out his tapes to buy. For Chalino, the attack he suffered wasn't a coincidence. He believed someone had sent Edward to do it, possibly in retaliation for something Chalino had done in the past. As a result, Chalino started to feel a bit paranoid and decided to change some things in his routine to minimize risks. He became afraid of being targeted again and leaving his family unsupported. Therefore, he chose to sell several valuable items to raise money and deposit it in the bank. His goal was to leave as much money as possible for his wife and children in case something happened to him. Chalino also began requesting the record label to pay him in advance for each tape produced, rather than taking a percentage of each sale. This decision meant that in the future, Chalino's family would miss out on millions of dollars from the sales of his music. Despite this, with the money he made from selling his possessions, along with the advance payment from the label, Chalino managed to raise a good amount to keep his family comfortable. In May 1992, Chalino was invited to perform at an event at Salón Bugambilias in Culiacán, the capital of Sinaloa, Mexico. His family was completely against him performing in Mexico due to the dangers he faced in the country. However, Chalino was offered a substantial sum, $20,000, just to sing a few songs. He then asked for 50% of the amount in advance, which was paid to him without any issues. From that point on, there was no way for him to cancel the show. At the time, Culiacán had a population of just over 600,000 inhabitants. According to sources, over 2,000 people were expected to attend Chalino's show, a significant number compared to the city's total population. The concert was scheduled for May 15th, and Chalino was excited. On the day of the performance, Chalino took the stage and began singing his songs. Everything was going normally until at one point he received a note. He paused his singing to read what was written, and his expression changed instantly. He appeared nervous, as if the contents of the note were troubling him. Seconds later, Chalino resumed singing, and the show continued. All of this was filmed, as you can see, and the footage went viral online decades later. The show ended shortly after midnight. It is said that Chalino rushed off the stage. He waved to some fans and headed towards a car with one of his brothers and a few friends. After driving for a few minutes, Chalino and his group were intercepted by other vehicles, 4 black Chevrolet Suburbans. In those vehicles were several armed men who identified themselves as state police. One of the men tried to pull Chalino's brother out of the car, and Chalino attempted to talk to them. At that moment, he realized that he was the target and that they probably weren't federal officers. Chalino lied to the men, saying he barely knew the people in the car and that he was just giving them a ride after the show. The men told Chalino that their commander wanted to see him to talk. Deep down, Chalino knew it was a lie. He then looked at his brother and said, "I'll go with them. My time has come." Chalino got into one of the cars, and the men left the scene at high speed. The next morning, 2 farmers found Chalino Sanchez's body near an irrigation canal along the Mexican Federal Highway 15 in Culiacán. He was blindfolded, and his wrists showed signs of being tied. He had been shot twice in the neck. The crime had a huge impact in Mexico and also within the Latino community in the southern United States. The tapes containing Chalino's songs sold even more, and many who didn't know him began to discover his music. The record label that held all the copyrights to Chalino's songs promoted new albums with previously unreleased recordings, as well as songs that had already been released. Over 150 songs about Chalino were released in 1992 through other artists. At the time, the Mexican police investigated the case but got nowhere. Many believed that Chalino was a victim of a cartel and that the police were bribed to not investigate properly. The motives that led to the crime remain a mystery, as does the identity of those responsible. Chalino Sanchez's wake and burial took place at the Panteón de los Vasitos in Sinaloa, Mexico. The farewell ceremony was attended by thousands of people. Chalino's son, Adán Sánchez, followed in his father's footsteps and became a popular singer. He was raised by his mother in California and started singing at a very young age. He adopted his father's name and managed to build a solid fan base. Adán released his first album in 1994 when he was only 10 years old. The album was titled Soy el hijo de Chalino, which translates to I am Chalino's son. Adán achieved some success with the Mexican youth and the Latino community in the southern United States. Everything indicated that the boy had a promising future in music, but unfortunately a tragic event occurred. On March 27, 2004, Adán embarked on a tour in his father's home state of Sinaloa. He was en route to a show in the city of Tuxpan and was traveling on the highway between Rosario and Escuinapa. At some point, the tire of his vehicle, a 1990 Lincoln Town Car that had belonged to his father, blew out. After the tire blew, Adán lost control of the vehicle and fell into a ditch. The car rolled over several times, and since he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, he was thrown out of the vehicle and died instantly. He was just 18 days shy of his 20th birthday. Adán's body was sent back to the United States, and his family held a public wake on April 1, 2004, at St. John of God Church in Norwalk, California. The wake drew national media attention due to civil unrest in the neighborhood surrounding the church that evening. Since Adán was not well known among English-speaking authorities, local officials underestimated his fan base and were unprepared when over 15,000 young people flooded the streets to attend the ceremony. As the day progressed, the crowd of mourners began to get out of control. The police were called in to disperse the crowd, using riot gear and carrying non-lethal weapons. Some people in the crowd started vandalizing property, and the police had to intervene quickly. At that time, one of Adán's aunts, Juanita Sánchez, cried out that Adán would surely be very sad about his fans' behavior. In 2005, a memorial statue was erected for Adán in front of the La Que Buena radio station in Burbank, California. Both Chalino and Adán are well-known figures in Mexico. To this day, the police still do not know who was responsible for the crime against Chalino.